Hello and welcome to Do More with Your Money. On today's podcast episode, I am joined by Mike Troxell of Modern Financial Planning. He's an Investopedia Top 100 financial advisor who specializes in helping folks with stock options and RSUs. So I'm really excited to have him on the podcast today, share his expertise. Thank you for coming on, Mike.
Thanks, TJ. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so it's awesome to connect with you because obviously we've been friends for a while now and we've done some content in the past. And so I'm really excited to kind of come full circle and really tap into your expertise around the equity compensation piece because that is something that we share kind of a passion for of who we serve. And so really looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Let's dive in.
Awesome. So what I want to start with is basically just walk me through your framework of how you start to even think about evaluating somebody that has a more complex equity situation, right? So let's say maybe they were working at a startup and they were compensated in stock options. And maybe they did have some just regular shares as well, but they come to you and they have a substantial part of their net worth tied up in their company stock. What are the first things that you're thinking about and what do you want to address?
For sure. I think with any client situation, we're trying to set priorities, right? And an easy example of that would be maybe one that you just mentioned, concentration risk, or they have a large percentage of their net worth in one stock. For another client, it could be a couple with a few young children and potentially no life insurance, right? So equity or not, that's always a part of our process is setting a list of priorities and an order of importance, and we match that up with the clients. And like, here's some things we think we should attack first versus their priorities, and we kind of work down in that direction. And so on the equity side, a couple of things that come to mind are concentration, right? It's like they have a lot of equity. Let's say it's a public company, a lot of their net worth in one stock. Okay, that would usually be towards the top of the list. And even like skipping ahead a little bit, and this conversation is not always just a one-time thing. For a lot of folks, that's just a ongoing, we're always going to be readdressing it type of thing. And it's rare that someone has, say, their stock is 80% of their net worth. And on day one, they say, okay, I want to reduce that down to 7.5%.
Mhm.
And we never talk about it again, right? That almost never happens. It's, let's say they keep it at they want to keep it at 80, or they want to get it down to 50, or whatever it is. That's always going to be a sort of a line item that we're going to readdress. And it's not really a, hey, you should sell. It's more so, hey, this is a big piece of the pie. This is a big factor in the equation of your financial outcome, right? So we're just going to always touch on it. And the other side of it is on a timely side, whether it's like you're leaving and maybe there's an exercise window, maybe there's an IPO coming up, right? So I'd say those are like the two bigger pieces of of when it's on the top of the order of importance, concentration and a time component. Other than that, with equity, it's the annual potentially reviewing of, should we exercise? How do you feel about the stock? How do you feel about the company? How confident are you? We'll always have those conversations.
No, that makes a ton of sense. It's not a one-time thing. It's consistently going, "Hey, what does your concentration look like?" As in, what percentage of your assets are tied up in this individual stock? And then it's gonna be hard to divest of that, especially if it's done very well. And so it's really that sounds like framework of regret minimization, which I think I kinda wanna hear your thoughts on is just real world practicality. How do you bring somebody through that thought process, that framework for understanding minimizing regret in the sense that, hey, there's if we lock in this level of diversification, right? If you believe in your long-term investment strategy, how that can translate to actually enjoying life more using that money. So how do you walk somebody through that like regret minimization?
Yeah, I like that you said real world because it is tricky, right? And any book you read or any blog you maybe read on personal finance, it's all about diversification and never own an individual stock, right? And even in our world, if I ever see financial commentators or social media say the same thing, or you should not hold a single RSU from your company, right? I've never met anybody like that. So that to me is not real world. Um, and the old me would have had similar views, like, oh, stocks are bad, and this and that. But then you work with so many families that are in these situations and big numbers, right? I mentioned 80% earlier, and that's definitely on the bigger end.
Mhm.
We've seen everywhere from, you know, 20s, 30s, 40s, all the way up to 70, 80, right? We see it all. And over time, we've definitely shifted our view to be more of a partner with these folks. And so
Sure.
we want them to understand what the ramifications are. If they want to keep all of it, okay, like good for you, right? I want to ensure that you maybe have more of a sparring background than I do with training, and I've never sparred in my life, but we find ourselves referring to ourselves sometimes as sparring partners with clients. Where it's like, okay, they might have a decision or a feeling. Let's say I want to buy this house, but on the equity side, it's I want to hold all of it. Okay, that's perfectly fine. Like we're gonna throw a lot of stuff at you, different scenarios, different ideas, different maybe points that support your feelings and view, points that don't support it or go against it, right? Counterpoints, all sorts of stuff. And we really want to flesh it out because there's a lot of emotion tied up in these decisions,
Mhm.
especially like buying a house, right? But equity as well. Like they're really emotional. And the CEOs are motivational and the Slack channels are lit, as they say, and it will make people feel terrible if they sell. And there's a lot of emotion tied up in it. And so we don't want to take that first answer as the end all answer. I want to hold this stock. And then we don't just go on our merry way. It's like, okay, great. Sounds good. You want to do that? Perfect. And then we'll kind of go through the sparring exercise. We'll go through it a lot. And we really want to flesh it out. And again, that is ever evolving. And as time goes on, we're kind of continuing the conversation just to ensure we want the client's actions to really reflect their beliefs and their feelings and and everything. And sometimes a quick answer like, I want to sell everything or I want to
Mhm.
keep everything. It's that that's a
Yeah.
little bit maybe not sincere.
No, I that makes a ton of sense. I think a lot of the time, our role, like you said, is like when you talk about sparring, to me, it's like you're counteracting a little bit of more of a balancing act, right? So if a client wants to make a really aggressive decision, maybe it's, hey, let's think about being a little more conservative. And then on the vice versa, right? You're being too conservative, right? You're holding too much cash, right? Let's be a counterbalance on the other side and saying, like, hey, here's why it makes sense to take on more risk. And so in these complex equity situations, like you said, where maybe it's a vast portion of your net worth, it makes sense to kind of push back with that sparring exercise. My next question that I had I wanted to ask you is just on the technical side of things. So let's say we are coming up to some type of liquidity event and we've had share price value increase substantially. What are some tax planning ideas or things that clients can do to help mitigate their tax situation with a large windfall?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I don't know many secrets. I don't know many secrets. I think a lot of times they think we hold all the
And
secrets,
that's a
but
good
there's
thing to
there's
say too, because sometimes people get misconstrued with that.
for sure there's definitely little things you could do, and the closer to an IPO, the less tools you have at your disposal. And I think with a lot of different, well, with options specifically, let's say restricted stock awards, RSAs, not RSUs, fairly restricted stock, ISOs and NSOs, the earlier the exercise, well, assuming a good outcome, right? The earlier you really acquire those shares, the better the outcome tax wise.
Mhm.
Whether that's whether there's QSBS in there, or whether, which is basically tax exclusion in a sense, or reduced tax rate and stuff like that. The closer you get to an IPO, the more your hands are tied. But potentially there's little thing. Maybe you could exercise some shares to shift some of your gain to short-term capital gains, or to long-term lower rates versus short-term. And I think around IPO taxes are very challenging mentally as well, because it's an exciting time. And let's say the average case, let's go with the average case. You have not exercised any shares, so you have not started your clock towards long-term lower taxes.
Mhm.
IPO window is coming up in a few months. So it's like, you know what? I want to start exercising the shares now so I can start that clock. So you exercise the shares, IPO happens, let's say 2 months later. And let's say you have liquidity on day one, just to be easy. So on day one, you have this real live asset, right? It's liquid. You can realize it. It's been illiquid before, or it's been make believe before. You haven't owned it, it hasn't been public, so you couldn't sell it. But now it's real. And now you're in this pickle where you have, let's call it life changing wealth, but you're going to get hammered on taxes,
Mhm.
or you're going to keep that ball in play, keep it at risk for, in this example, 10 more months until you get to a lower tax rate. You surpass 1 year of holding, right? You exercise it 2 months prior, but then anything could happen in that 10 months, right? Ideally, the stock stays the same or goes up. But as we've all seen, that's not always the case, right? The stock could totally crater. And I think that's an example where tax planning or
Right.
tax avoidance or whatever it is super, super tricky, especially when you're dealing with big numbers, right?
Mhm.
A 10 or 15% difference in taxes, for some, that's a big deal. For others, it's not. But when you're talking millions and millions of dollars, it's easy to get swayed, right? It's like, oh, you can save $3 million in taxes if you do this. Okay, I'll do it. And then that money evaporates overnight.
Right.
So long-winded way of saying, when you're getting close to the goal line and IPO territory, there's
Little you can
maybe a
do.
little things to do. Yeah, there's not
Well, what would
not
you say about,
not
like, shifting to maybe you were somebody who was earlier in your career and you were doing some Roth 401k contributions, like, you were splitting it. Would it make sense to shift to 100% pre-tax 401k contributions in that case?
for sure. Yeah, there's always little things for sure.
Mhm.
There's whether that's retirement contributions or even HSA, or there's obviously the donation factor. If you're itemizing deductions, and if you're in a higher income year, right, accelerating charitable deductions via potentially a donor advised fund, right? There's definitely things you could do around the edges,
Right.
but
But the main thing is getting that clock ticking on the long-term capital gain treatment early on, right? So whether if you have the shares, maybe that's making an 83B election if you can do that for unvested shares. And then, like you said, with the stock options, exercising, being mindful of AMT, getting that clock ticking. But if you haven't done some of those strategies and you're coming up on that liquidity event, there's not much you can do other than these smaller tax planning decisions.
exactly, because another big popular one people talk about is like moving out of state, right?
Mhm.
Moving from California or Massachusetts or New York to Nevada, Florida, Texas, and even then the tax laws are pretty cut and dry, where the throughout your vesting period, that income is tied to that state.
Okay.
So even if you leave California, for example, the day before the IPO, all of that is still
Mm.
claimed to California. So for big items, you're limited, but there's definitely some smaller things you can do, that we recommend, and it makes a dent, or tax loss
Right.
harvesting would have.
Exactly. So, yeah, touch on that as well, like, with, what do you mean by tax loss harvesting?
Good question. I think in the most simplest terms, it's taking a small loss on your tax return up to $3,000. If you have some stocks or some ETFs or mutual funds that are at a loss and you're in a particularly high income year, it could make sense to take some of those losses just to offset some of the gains. And again, it's not always going to move the needle, but it's just little things here and there. It always makes sense to evaluate, and then we can go back to the client and say, "Hey, here's a couple things we're gonna do. It's gonna save you X, Y, Z, but it's not like we're gonna have $1 million gain that we're just gonna get away tax free unless you do something very proactive."
Right. No, that makes sense. And on that same note, what are your thoughts with direct indexing, right? So for people that aren't familiar, where like you might own instead of owning an S&P 500 index fund, owning those 500 companies directly for a tax loss harvesting strategy if maybe you are in a higher tax bracket or are expecting a lot of capital gains. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah. So this would be a little bit of an off the cuff answer because I haven't spent a ton of time thinking about it, but
That's fair.
I think it makes sense for in a few situations. Let's say the situations where it could make sense is A, the person fully understands it, B, or proceed with it, and C, you're also continually adding and saving money over time. In situations where it could not make may not make sense is where let's say you are direct indexing. So instead of owning one ETF of the S&P 500, you now own 500 stocks. But if the manager is taking losses over the first 2, 3, 5 years, and you're not adding to it, you're not repurchasing shares. There's a situation where you just end up with a very long brokerage statement.
Yep.
You end up with 500 shares, different positions. You end up with a lot of embedded, just locked in gains at lower bases and high, and then you're kind of a little bit of in a pickle there. And then potentially you find it annoying on the brokerage side of things where it's like, how much did I really gain? And now I own these 500 stocks, right? People just like simplicity.
Yeah.
I like simplicity, right?
Same.
It's there's reasons to own to have 10 bank accounts and 39 credit cards and 500 individual stocks, and there's reasons to have one bank account, a couple credit cards, and a few
No,
ETFs.
that's fair. That's fair. Yeah, I guess
So
the simplicity factor is definitely a huge trade-off with that. I was just wondering if you thought it could make sense if you are experiencing if you think you're gonna have a liquidity event and have a lot of realized gains, but I guess it could might not be that substantial depending on how much you're investing.
yeah,
Alright, so let's take a step back here and talk a little bit more about the actual life planning side of things, right? So, we've talked about, okay, maybe you have a windfall with equity, or maybe you just are a normal receiver of equity compensation, and you're thinking about every year, "How much of my RSU should I be vesting, and how much should I be saving in general?" What for somebody that maybe has experienced a little bit of a windfall, right, with stock compensation, what are some things that people are doing with that money? What's the obviously, it's personalized by every different person, but in your experience, like, what have you seen people do?
and just to make sure following the question, more so on the life
Exactly, yeah,
side of
like, are
things
exactly.
versus. I think that's one of the trickiest things, honestly. It's very just with experience, I find it can be very daunting to hear from somebody, "Hey, you're in a great position. You have you have all the insurance you need. Your tax stuff is optimized. You got you're doing all the right retirement contributions. You have enough money. Like you're in a very strong bulletproof situation." And the next tier, the next level is now what? Now what do we do? Right? What do we want to do with this our life? Like what do we want our life to look like? It's it's a lot easier in a sense, right? And you can almost bring this back to like education, where you have your first grade and then you got your second grade and your third grade. And there's no like big life, I don't know, philosophical existential decisions. It's like you just keep proceeding, you keep going to the next class, and you graduate, and you go here and here, and then finally you're out in the real world, right? Whether you're 23 or 33, whatever it is, then it's like, wow, what do I do now, right? And it's challenging. And that's why, and I don't know how many will admit it, but that's definitely why there's a portion of folks that say, forget this, I want to go back to grad school because I want to kind of go back. So I find it similar with money and finances, right? Where there's like almost like a tier of things you want to do, and you want to maybe get out of debt, and you want to get enough money in your emergency fund, and you maybe want to max out retirement accounts, maybe you want to buy a house or fund this and fund that. And you might not have $50 million, but maybe you're just on track to, everything's good and strong, and then you're on track, you're making a lot of money. So I find there's definitely a parallel there where it's like, what do we want? Do we want to have a bigger family? Do we want to pay off my mom's mortgage? Do we want to get that ski house? Do we want to take a sabbatical, right? Do we want to retire early? Do we want to
Mhm.
have one spouse stay at home? It's just like more difficult. They're more difficult problems. And and so, like, from experience, I think because they're difficult questions and problems, a lot of times they're not fully addressed. A lot of times the easy thing to do is just to continue,
Mhm.
continue earning, continue working, saving. I think lifestyle creep is real. And I don't know what the term is, but I think getting set in your, or really used to your savings amounts and your income,
Mhm.
maybe income, adapting to that or whatever. I think that's also a real thing. And I think people really struggle with that, right? It's like, I'm making this much money. I'm used to saving $100,000 per year, and it just makes me feel good. And having one spouse stay at home or do X, Y, or Z, even though that would maybe be the preferred scenario, there's like a level of anxiety there. It's like we almost can't do it. I don't know if it's lifestyle creep, but you're so attached to it. You know, again, going down a left turn
Mhm.
here. I've heard people saying this before, and I definitely, well, a good chunk of me finds truth in it, is, or it's like, have I've heard people say have children before you're too comfortable money wise,
Mhm.
because you're basically, maybe you never taste what it feels like to just be really rich. It's just in quotes here. Um, and you're making $1 million a year, and then the kids you might start looking at them as like a disruption to that,
Mhm.
right? I'm gonna to earn less money. I'm gonna have all these expenses, and it's gonna mess up my spreadsheet, right? My fire spreadsheet versus, um, I someone had them before they reach that level, and
Ignorance is
is viewing
bliss.
it differently. Ignorance is bliss, I guess. So, yeah, I think it's a really challenging area, the whole life planning.
Yeah.
It's one side to have conversations and talk about it and try to guide and help people, but I find on the other side of it, it's a challenge, right?
Yeah.
And I was talking to a client yesterday who she had an unexpected, unneeded little windfall, and sure, she's very frugal. I'm trying to nudge her, like, vacation, see your kids, see your grandkids. This, like, what should we do with the money? And everything on my list was not in
Mhm.
but
Habit.
her inclination, right, was just to, put it in the market.
No, I get that makes a lot of
So,
sense.
how do you think about that? How do you think about that? Maybe you're probably more seasoned on that than I.
I would say well, I was just meeting with a client earlier today, and they were having their first child, and I would consider them high earners and around 500K a year, and they're, like you said, saving that $100,000 plus a year, and it is a interesting pivot then all of a sudden to start considering the cost of daycare or nanny and then education savings, right? Like, what that's gonna look like, and then how that impacts things, and like you said, there's a mindset shift there, but I think that I have not had children, but everybody that I hear from that has children, like, doesn't necessarily regret it, like, it's a worthwhile maybe not return on investment, like, in the monetary sense, right, but return on life. So, what I was trying to stress to them from a life planning standpoint is you do the best you can given the resources you have. Every year we sit down and Q1 and we look at their cash flow and right capital, and we make the best decisions based on the available information. The whole reason we try to live below our means and make smart decisions is so you have flexibility. You're not always going to hit that 20% personal savings rate, but if you maintain good habits over the long term and put yourself in a position to succeed, you're going to be fine. Most people that are doing financial planning early on, I think they underestimate how much money they're going to have, honestly. Like, I think there's an abundance
Uh,
out there for at least the people that financial advisors tend to serve because they're usually it's somebody that has at least a certain level of income or assets. And so you don't want to, the goal isn't to hoard up as many dollars as we can, right? It's to actually end up using them. So that would be my thoughts.
no, I agree, and I guess one additional thought is not everything is a financial decision, right? Let's just use home buying as an example. There's a People buy homes for a lot of reasons, and a lot of that, whether they admit it or not, a lot of that is emotional, right? And at least in the big metro areas, a lot of the spreadsheeting,
Right.
if you did that, would point to renting. But oh, we still want to buy this house in this neighborhood. Maybe it's next to the grandparents. So there's a lot of so it's not purely a financial decision. And sometimes I think we over financialify decisions. It's like, hey, it's again, as an example, like kids is one example, but it's like if you go down that rabbit hole, then nothing makes sense, right? Buying food doesn't make sense. Getting a
Higher
haircut,
cost, yeah.
right? So I would throw kids in that category, right? Like that's not a fine. That's like that's more of a like you said, life planning, right? It's like a life decision. That's not like a financial decision in in a sense. Like, where hey, you got enough money, there's enough coming in, you're gonna be fine, right? It's like do that for you. Like, don't don't use an Excel spreadsheet to figure out if you want to have family, right? That's
Yeah,
like um. So again, I think that's us as professionals continuing to refine our skills to
definitely.
get people to turn off the spreadsheet.
100%. And listen, I'm guilty of spreadsheeting as much as anybody. Obviously, being in this industry, right, and this career path is like your focus is always on how can I add tangible value, right? Like, what's the most optimal way to invest and be tax efficient? And like you said, we talk about some of those things. And within the life planning, what the practicality of how you want to live your life, we can touch around the edges to optimize your resources. But ultimately, what matters at the end of the day is the life you want to live, right? Not, that is really what matters. So I am as guilty as anybody of being like, hey, what is the most optimal financial decision, right? Like, yeah, I wouldn't buy this house and pay this much in interest, but if you're going to be there a really long time and it's close to the people you care about, then guess what? That is the right decision for you. So on that note, I wanna take a step back a little bit more on the technical side because you mentioned one thing is sabbatical, okay? And I think this is a new not a new concept, but I think I'm seeing it more increasingly is with millennials in particular is, "Hey, I would like to have a little bit more optionality to take time off from work," right? I know I can't afford necessarily financial independence, but hey, maybe I'm a dual income household and we're gonna take turns taking time off. Different situations, or I've seen, like, self-employment, right? Both spouses are in corporate America, one person transitions to contracting, things like that, and so, how do you approach sabbatical, creating an income stream? Maybe if you can't fully creating an income stream from investment assets, supplementing income. Wha Have you had sabbatical experiences? What are your thoughts there?
Yep, good question. I've only had a couple sabbatical situations with clients, and both times it wasn't necessarily, you know, an income stream per se. In these situations, they're pretty disciplined on the expense side, and we just made sure there was enough set aside
Mm,
for the higher end of their sabbatical. Let's say they were thinking 6 to 12 months. We're aiming more on the 12-month side, where it's like basically cash in the bank, or these days, money market type of situation, getting that 4 or 5%.
right.
So in those situations, that's how we approach it, just making sure they had enough set aside. I think going back to life planning for a second, I think the idea is floated a little bit more, but it's just, again, it's just hard to execute, right? It's hard. Um, I don't know who said this, or but I've heard it, and I totally agree with the last part, at least, that the three most addictive things in the world are drugs, alcohol, and a weekly salary.
Right.
And I know we did definitely see that. I know we both have been there too. Or it's like you get that salary just coming in, you're on your benefits. It's just like it's really hard to turn that off, whether it's sabbatical, early retirement, where you're starting withdrawals, going into self-employment. Like it's just really mentally challenging to actually jump out. It's easier to talk about skydiving than it is to jump out of the airplane. Like they're two totally different things.
No, that's fair. Yeah, when you actually start seeing your withdrawals come out, right? If you are using maybe your portfolio assets to supplement it, and I agree with you. That makes sense as far as if you're planning a finite period for a sabbatical, you might as well just have that runway in cash. And then I assume you still have investment assets as well, right? That you can hold on to for the long
Mhm.
run. I guess I was just thinking about like maybe a little bit longer if I have had some client situations where they did experience a substantial windfall and were using their portfolio assets, right? And so it's basically like
Mhm.
obviously that early financial. Now they did have some self-employment income, but for the most part, it's coming from their portfolio. And the thing I think about is it is there is no certainty, right? We don't know how long they're gonna it's just like retirement planning, but with a much longer time horizon, right? If they're in their 30s or 40s. And so just thinking about again, like how much you can really extract in income from a portfolio, I think is something that is tricky. Like you said, people underestimate how much it takes to really supplement that.
Yeah, I mean that's a tricky one, right? An uncertain, indefinite amount of time, right? If they're in their 30s or something, I think that's super tricky. One of the things we didn't touch on in terms of, or in this conversation about like technical and this and that sabbatical, one thing I try to zoom in on is employability,
Mm,
because stuff starts to hit the fan. Like you mentioned, okay, you have your savings, maybe you can tap your brokerage or investment. It's like, how employable are you? And is there anything we can do to keep that sharp,
mhm.
right? Keep that asset a lot alive and well. And so I think that usually leads to good conversations, because if you're still very employable, then that allows you to take a little bit more risk and maybe stretch out that sabbatical or stretch out that 5 year period. Or maybe there's things you can do during that time off to remain employable, whether it's part time work and consulting and contracting, or
Mhm.
building something, right? So I think that's
No,
one.
that's an
That's like
amazing
the
point.
ultimate. That's the ultimate backstop.
Yeah, that's an amazing point because I have had that brought up to me previously is like, "Hey, if I do take a prolonged sabbatical, is that going to impact my employability?" Right? Like, because people are gonna ask, "Well, why did you take time off or for this prolonged period?" And that's a great question, right? Always at the end of the day, your skills, right, are always gonna be unless you've accumulated a very large portfolio, your skills are gonna be one of your largest assets, right? When you think about how much income can I earn, what's the present value of that kind of thing, right? So, that probably is a bigger risk, right? Like, if you could take 10 years off, you might be fine financially with your resources if you can attain your market value 10 years later, right? But if your skills diminish or it's hard, you can't get that same level of employment, then that is definitely a risk. And I think that is the bigger risk that is kind of less talked about than when it comes to the financial side with the portfolio.
Totally. And you bring up a good point. It's the biggest asset, right? And or it's the most important one. If it's not the biggest, right? It's the most important one. And if that's gone, then you're reliant on that portfolio that you mentioned. And I've heard a few times that the strongest financial plan is the most flexible one.
Ye
Right, forgetting the exact phrase, but if your situation's going to be totally screwed if inflation ticks up one extra percent, it's like, man, that's a tough spot to be. But if you're able or willing, I think willing is maybe the most important to do certain things, then you're going to be fine. Whether it's like, hey, I'm willing to cut expenses. I'm willing to relocate. I'm willing to get two roommates. I'm willing to go back to work. If you're willing to do all these things, and it's like, hey, you're probably going to be fine. It's going to work out differently depending on your desires and whatever that inflation rate is. But if you're willing to do some of these things, then you're going to be totally fine. If you're not willing to do anything and you only have so much saved, then yeah, let's
Yeah,
start hoping and praying.
absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. Alright, I wanna switch gears a little bit here with you is I wanna get your opinion on obviously, we've been in the industry for a fair amount of time now, and we've seen a lot of changes, and the industry is still changing on a daily basis. But where do you think in 2024 and moving forward, the value for financial advisors is in adding value to client situations? And where do you see our careers and industry headed as far as serving clients moving forward?
That's a good question. And for all the listeners, a lot of podcast hosts send questions ahead of time.
Sorry, my
TJ did
bad.
not do
You know,
that. So,
see, this is my bad because, yeah,
no,
like
this
the
is, I appreciate the fastball. That's not a dig at you. That's more of a I'm gonna spit something out here and
that's how
haven't
we
thought too
like
much
to do
about it.
more with your money. It's basically give
That's real. This is
not
real.
take
This is like
yeah.
this is unscripted. Yeah, it was. It's interesting if you're listening to a podcast, you hear like a very challenging question, like, "What is the meaning of life?" And the person's like, "Oh wow." They say like, "Oh, really good question," and then they spit out like a perfectly articulate. It's like, okay, we know that was emailed before. Anyway, so just to delaying here, so just to confirm the question, 2024 and beyond,
So where do you
where do
see
I
the
see our
value and it's not an easy question, so I appreciate this, but basically, if you're a prospective client, right, and you're looking to work with an advisor and partner up, right, and you're a little bit more sophisticated, right? I think my experience has been millennials are a little bit more financially sophisticated. I think every generation kinda gets a little more. And what is the value add of an advisor, of a partnership there? And on all different ends. It doesn't have to be quantitative always. It can be a mixture of 2. I just like to hear your opinion on that.
yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I think in a lot of areas, there's obviously a lot of potential benefits, right? It's like you can kind of list out 10 different things, and it's whichever of these 10 apply more or less to certain people, right? I think in general, we underestimate the value of a thinking partner and accountability partner. Just a simple example, right, would be writing, right? Writers have editors. We've all written hundreds or thousands of emails, and maybe we've reread some of our emails in the past. It's like, what? I edited that email 10 times to this important person, and then I forgot the word like the in that sentence. Like, hey, how's that possible? So I think we underestimate the value of a second set of eyes, a thinking partner, and a well trained one. As we go through life, there's a lot of income coming in. There's a lot of assets at certain points. There's a lot of expenses. There's a lot of debts. There's a lot of taxes. And I think having a somebody to partner with on a technical side, but then also on the thinking partner side of that money is a tool, right? And this isn't just my opinion, right? We over the course of our careers, we'll have conversations with hundreds or thousands of people. It's like just being able to walk people through things, coach them through things. We've seen 30 other people in your exact situation. It allows us to give better advice, ask better questions, provide better perspectives, and at the end of the day, make a bigger impact on the clients we work with. So I think that that's the real value, right?
Yeah,
There's if you're just having someone look at your investments once a year and never ever talking to them,
sure.
I don't think there's a lot of value there. I'd say the value would be sometimes it makes you feel good that someone's there just in case, right? Almost like an insurance policy where if I need something, it's there and it makes them feel good. Is there a ton of, what's the ROI on that?
Mhm,
It's tough to say.
mhm.
A lot of the industry would say, oh, there's no value. And I'd say you could definitely argue that. But there's some value, right? There's some value in having someone feel safe and secure. Um,
No, I could definitely agree. I think that accountability partner, and again, if you have a vision, or I think my what I try to look at it is like, hey, I want to understand the vision, and that not everybody knows that, especially early on if they're younger. So we're just going to build good habits and make smart decisions to have flexibility for the future. But then the idea is, okay, if we have a vision of what you want, what's the most optimal path with your resources to use it as a tool moving forward? So, and then like you said, all the things that you mentioned about accountability partner, thinking partner. Again, I think the word partner is huge because, again, if you're going to somebody who all we do all day is think about different ways that we can add value to client situations, staying up to date on changes in tax code and understanding the available retirement contribution. These are things, it's about delegating like anything. It's about what is your time worth, right? Like I could cut my grass, but I'd rather outsource that task, right? And obviously, this is going to be a little more complicated. So maybe that's why there's different rates of what we pay. But the point is that we all can benefit from delegating things out that aren't our primary area of expertise. So I didn't mean to put you on the spot about that one, but I just wanted to hear your thoughts there.
yeah, I mean, I totally agree on the delegation front, especially with a lot of the folks we work with and in Silicon Valley and those type of companies, right, where the earning power is so high and the equity potential is so high. Your time is way better spent trying to work more, earn more, get bigger bonuses or larger grants or this or that. And then you reach a certain point and then go enjoy life. It's like, hey, you got a lot of money. There's a lot in savings. There's a lot invested. Do you want to? I know maybe you get some joy out of reading these financial blogs for a couple hours a day. Sure. But would you really, would you rather maybe go skiing or mountain biking or this and that, like, or spending time with your kids? There's a lot of some of these. It's interesting with the do-it-yourself community weekend, which and I totally respect. Is there's a chunk of them that it's costing them hours per day, right? It's not like I'm going to do it myself and never think about it and never do anything and save my time and money. It's like, no, I'm going to save my money by not paying this person. And in exchange, I'm going to be deep into these internet forums for multiple hours per day.
Right. That's a great point. I think sometimes people that maybe aren't entrepreneurs or business owners, right? They don't think about that in the same way, right? As an investment. So like if you are like again, if you're just a W-2 employee, you might not think of these things as investments. Maybe they're not a business expense per se, but again, at the end of the day, if your hourly rate is worth something and you're not going to have the time or you don't want to put the time in to learn these things or to execute these strategies or to be accountable on these strategies, right? There's all these different things that factor in into that return. And so I'm constantly asking myself that is like, hey, where can I delegate things? Like this is my first year outsourcing my taxes, right? I could do my own taxes, but I want to know that I have an expert that I can lean on that's going to prepare them properly if they have gotten a little more complicated. And my time is just not worth spent actually going through and doing my taxes. So paying a premium fee to an independent CPA makes sense for me. And so I think just it's a hard thing to get past that sometimes for people, but I think once you start doing that, see the benefits.
Yep. I think it's also worth stating, and share this with a bunch of clients, is that we wish it wasn't so complicated, right? Between just again, just taxes and equity, right? The There's the restricted stock, there's the ISOs, the NSOs, the RSUs, direct listings and IPOs and secondaries. And then on the tax side, right? Even a simple-ish tax return, you're still getting a lot of documents. You're still getting W-2s, 1099s, 1098s, 1095s, a bunch of other stuff, charitable, medical, mortgage interest, right? Different receipts for this and that. And then on the benefit side, there's the IRA and the Roth IRA, or there's the SEP IRA or the simple IRA, or the
Yeah.
pre-tax or the Roth 401k or the after-tax 401k. Like there's a lot of stuff. And it's not that it's rocket science, but it's like, hey, it's complicated. I agree it's complicated. I wish it wasn't like this. But when you're a high earner, you're a high performer, you value your time, you value your personal life and your hobbies, your family, and this and that. There's a lot of stuff going on and there's a lot of stuff to keep track of. And it's not like you're not smart enough. You need me. It's like, hey, it's complicated. It's complicated for me
I'm
too.
cutting through the
And
noise.
it's right. It's like, hey, there's a lot of value to just outsource all of that thinking to someone else and kind of move on with your life
Mhm.
versus trying to navigate it all. And maybe you navigate all of it perfectly 9 out of 10 times. And then maybe there's one year where you made just one mistake
Mm.
and maybe it was a very expensive mistake,
Yeah.
which we've all seen it. It's like, oh, I thought it said this, but it said that. It was off by like an inch, but I clicked the wrong button and then
Yeah.
now I owe $100,000 more in
That is
taxes.
the scary part about money or wealth, I'd say, is that these the these small decisions have massive impact, right? And like you said, one mistake can be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, depending on the dollar amount, right? Or you weren't aware, right? The AMT thing with stock options, that's a classic, right? I exercised my options because I wanted to get the clock ticking, right? I read in Reddit that if I hold for a year and 2 years from grant, I'll get long-term cap gain, but then I got hit with this $100,000 tax bill, and I don't have $100,000 liquid, and now I have to.
Yeah,
So,
we've all seen
yeah,
it, and it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. It's like, oh well, that thing you read in Reddit, yeah, it was right. It was right,
right.
but it was just this one little thing that it didn't mention, and then it kind of screwed everything up. We've all seen stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that with people, right, we're all I think this is just a general note, like with wisdom, right? We have all the information, but there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom, and right, and wisdom comes through experience and knowing how to apply that information, right? So I think that that's where I was going with that. So
Mhm.
one question that I ask every podcast guest is just one thing, one recommendation for the audience, how they can do more with their money. It can be technical, it can be life satisfaction, whatever you're thinking, whatever's top of mind. Maybe it's, hey, you know what? Consider having kids. Maybe that's doing more with maybe not.
Well, see, that's the theme of the podcast. Full disclosure, I have 4 kids. Some might think it's crazy or impressive, but why not? Why not? Let's go with
I
that.
like it.
We'll
It's
have
good.
one extra kid. Everyone, they got enough money, and 99 out of 100 people will say these things are the greatest things in the world for me. And well, hey, I like ice cream. I want more ice cream. So there you go. You can afford it. If you're listening, you can afford it.
Right.
Uh, you'll never regret it. Have another. And
I like it. I like it.
there,
So there you go. That's how to do more with your money. Have more kids.
there you go.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Mike, and sharing your expertise. And I really appreciate it. It's good catching up with you. You're a great friend and peer. And so, yeah, thank you again.
Hey, TJ, thanks for having me. Always good seeing you.